Well, good morning, everyone, and thank you all for coming in such number this morning on a beautiful Mancunian summer's day. I want to begin by introducing our keynote lecturer this year, David Rundle, who is a senior lecturer in Latin and Palaeography and Latin Palaeography at the University of Kent at its Centre for Medieval and Early Modern Studies. And David is really the foremost Renaissance historian in more than one sense in the British Isles. A colleague whose work bridges history and literature, Latin and the European vernacular languages, the medieval and the early modern period, and whose work is marked by a profound commitment to the acquisition and cultivation through study and through teaching of the technical and linguistic skills that are or should be central to the foundation of all of our disciplines. David's work is bound together by conjoint interests in both the material form and the intellectual content of the late medieval and early modern book. His magnum opus was published in 2019, The Renaissance Reform of the Book and Britain, the English Quattrocento, and his magnissimum opus will be forthcoming. Maximum opus. I know. On England and the identity of Italian Renaissance humanism. It will come in future years. He is also working on a catalogue of the manuscripts, the medieval manuscripts of Magdalen College, Oxford, together with Ralph Hanna, which will form a counterpart to their 2017 catalogue of the manuscripts from Christchurch. And David, amongst many of his other offices, and Grand Corrector of 14th century German Latin, we would say magnissimum, but also many other wrong things. He is a general editor of the journal Medium Evum, the leading journal for medieval studies, broadly put, in the British Isles, and in which capacity I have great pleasure in working with him. David will speak to us today about the cultural geography of the English Quattrocento, situating and displacing Renaissance humanism. David.
Stephen, thank you very much for that introduction, and thank you for the invitation, and thank you for turning up on this, as you say, Mancunian summer's day. Yeah, and I'll come back to that just in a second. As Stephen was speaking, I was feeling both old and crusty, and I hope that I'll be able to demonstrate that there is a use to this, the detailed study of manuscripts in all their material and textual form, which allows us to ask and sometimes answer much bigger questions. What I want to talk to you about in the next 3/4 of an hour, 50 minutes, is what has the Northwest got to do with the Renaissance? Or what has the Renaissance got to do with the Northwest? Whichever way you want to put it. And how to explain this is personal. As you may be able to tell from my accent, I'm from around here. Yeah, good sense of irony there. I grew up in Cheshire, and indeed Manchester's Central Library and this library have a significant part to play. They are guilty of being responsible for why I'm studying today. So I really want to be able to demonstrate to you why the Northwest is so important. It also means that when I arrive in Manchester and it starts pouring down, I know that is a gentle knock back, rather than any insult. Second thing I should say is that there is a handout for today, which is this, and don't teach old dogs new tricks. Will that work? I've created a QR code for this so that you may want to use, if that works, and then we're going to just all find out that it doesn't work. But there is also a hard copy of it, which I can see that Steve would like to have. working? Yeah. It's working? Okay. And that will be useful, and it will also explain to you the structure of this. There are going to be 4 sections to this. Take this through, indeed, from the 19th century back into the 15th and 16th century, and then back into the 15th century again, with 2 significant figures being at the centre of this in the last section. In talking about what does the Northwest have to do with the Renaissance, I'm also thinking about larger questions which are summed up in concepts of the centre and the periphery. You may know the work of Ginsberg and Rundle, which was first published in 1979, translated into English in the 1980s, I think, and is a significant influence on the work of the foremost Renaissance historian in Britain, Peter Burke, particularly in this work, but also in later work, Hybrid Renaissance. These, in their work, are taking the concept of centre-periphery and trying to nuance it. What I'm going to suggest to you is that we should be even more radical than that. But we can start answering the question about the relationship between the Northwest and the Renaissance by saying the Renaissance would not exist if it was not for the Northwest, because it was born on the banks of the Mersey. It was born on the banks of the Mersey in the early 19th century. The concept of the Renaissance, which is a 19th century concept, has background in the 16th century with in particular works of Giorgio Vasari, but the idea of an age develops out of a ferment of intellectual study pre-Burckhardt, pre-Michelet, which comes from, in particular, William Roscoe, banker in Liverpool, satirized in the mid-19th century by De Quincey, as he's been dead 10 years, and in the 1950s by Dennis Hay. It is said that he was not troubled by an overgreat concern that he never visited. It's true, Roscoe hated being outside of Liverpool. He hated London. He hated going, he never went abroad. But he wrote 2 really significant books on Lorenzo de' Medici and then on another Leo Medici, Leo X. What's sometimes forgotten is that he is central to a Liverpudlian non-conformist group of Antiquarian scholars, which also includes his friend William Shepherd, who wrote a life of Poggio Bracciolini, leading humanist of the early 15th century, born in 1318, dies in 1459. And I'm going to talk about him in a second. In a work which was first published, as you can see, in 1802, expanded in 1837, but was also known across Europe because, like Roscoe's work, it was translated into Italian and became the foundational text for Italian development of the sense that there was a Renaissance. Now, this Renaissance, this Mersey-born Renaissance, take me back to the anyway. Ferrying the Renaissance across the Mersey is a concept of it as Italian, as happening within particularly Florence, because of course what is hiding behind us is a sense that Liverpool is the new Florence. Liverpool? Manchester. There's Liverpool here. Both of them, of course. And that sense of transposition reflected an early 15th century moment when the Florentine humanists thought they were transposing ancient Athens via ancient Rome to their city. This was a later stage of that translatio, that translation of intellectual glory. However, even in the work of Shepherd, or the knowledge of Shepherd, and of Roscoe, it wasn't all solely Italian. The Renaissance does not equal Italy. Shepherd knew this because Poggio Bracciolini spent 4 years in England, living in Southwark as a secretary to the Bishop of Winchester, Henry Beaufort. He may not have known that this manuscript, which is now in the Athenaeum in Liverpool, Athenaeum set up partly to buy up the books of William Roscoe where he found them, has in it annotations which are definitely not Italian, but rather than being Italian, are in an English secretary script. In other words, this is a demonstration of the availability of Italian-produced texts within the century of their production at the other end of Europe. And so, we can develop this understanding. For a moment, let me step back and make sure we've remembered what we're thinking about when we're talking about Renaissance humanism. It is a range of intellectual practices and activities which, in the 15th century in particular, are primarily produced in Latin. Translation of Greek into a particular style of Latin. That particular style of Latin is a Ciceronian style, a classicizing style, which then also informs the sorts of dialogues that are written, and a Renaissance revival of particular classical genres, like the familiar letter and the invective. It's not just about praise, but it's about hating people in the Renaissance. But also, as these two examples from collections in the Northwest show, it is about how it looks on the page. And what I've argued in the past is that the text, as we sometimes in a pseudo-Platonic way imagine it, as divorced from how it appears, that's not how these humanists are thinking. The lettering, the mise-en-page, the aspect of the script are the body language of a text. You cannot listen to somebody speaking without noticing their intonation, their posture, their hand gestures. Equally, you cannot read without noticing the decoration, the borders, the script. And there is a very conscious process of production of a clear script which is a reflection back to Caroline manuscript of the late 8th and 9th century, mediated through late Caroline or early Proto-Gothic of the 12th century. Some people, Stefano Zampone has recently died, and he would argue to some extent that this is a bogus Caroline minuscule, but it is a conscious reinvention. I emphasize this because the routes by which what we see in Italy occurring elsewhere involve this type of textual presentation. We can also notice that the routes taken include the production of letters in humanist Ciceronian classicizing Latin for diplomatic reasons, sent from Italy to England, but interestingly, more often from the city of Genoa than the city of Florence. And this is an example you can go read. Really important collection. Produced, this is a Genoese script, produced by a Genoese merchant probably in the mid-15th century. So, humanist texts are produced for an English audience. But also, texts which are related to the humanist transformation, like this work by Coluccio Salutati, the godfather, intellectual godfather of Poggio Bracciolini and his colleagues, moved to England into collections, in this case, Humphrey, Duke of Gloucester, one of the major collectors of the second quarter of the 15th century. He dies in 1447. Notice how early this is. We often think of the Renaissance as moving with a significant time lag. You should think of it as existing in real time across Europe. There is a slight time lag of maybe 10 to 20 years, but not the century, which is often in literature expressed in terms of the intellectual history, in terms of Renaissance humanism, not of the other artistic elements. And we might want to come back to that in questions. But as well as export from Italy of texts to England, import from Italy to England of texts, there are also texts produced for ownership in England. And an example, one which we'll be able to show in the next session, is this in this building, a set of texts translated from Greek into Latin of Plutarch, produced for the Englishman William Gray, later Bishop of Ely, who was at that point studying and travelling about Italy. It was produced for him, as you can see, in the humanist style of script. If you want to... Have I made it clear enough what the humanist style of script is, or do we need to have a few more minutes talking about that? Is it okay? You think we can move on? Okay. If it's not, come back and ask me questions later. Indeed, actually, at any point. Dylan Thomas, once late into an evening when he drank a lot, was talking to his friends and said, "Something in this room is boring me. I think it's me." So if at any point you want to interrupt and ask questions, just insult me if you can try. Just put up your hand and we can have a conversation. What's interesting in this case is that this manuscript is signed by its scribe. And its scribe is Theodoricus Nicolai Verkin, the Adambock, written in 1445. This is a Low Countries scribe working in Italy for an English patron. This, I think, symbolizes what I've come to call the Europolitan nature of the Renaissance. It is not a construction, however much the Florentines would like to believe it, of solely Florentines working in the beautiful piazze of their city, but rather an international card of producers, owners, readers. The history of humanism as it relates to England cannot be written, in particular, without the intervention of people from other countries. Sorry, there's not going to be a Brexit narrative here. Okay. And so, moving on from this. All this is old news. You know all this because you've all read this wonderful book. It's going very cheaply, I'm sure, online. Now, and when I wrote this book, I was very much thinking in national terms. So I'm grateful for this opportunity to actually speak in regional terms rather than national. And you might notice that Book and Britain and the English Quattrocento, no, I wasn't doing that Southern English thing of national everything to do with Britain. There's a reason for this move between the terminology of Britannia, which has an interesting pedigree in itself, and England. But a central argument for this, which is I'm developing in the book that Stephen mentioned, is what I've come to call the going against the oxcentric argument. I think many people make arguments which are oxcentric. In other words, they focus too much on Oxford. They focus on the sense that there are one or two places of location of humanism in England. Oxford, the home of lost causes and Renaissance humanism. What I'm suggested in this book is it's much more various than that. And indeed, that the centrality of Oxford only becomes possible because of these other places, and does so late. And so, instead of focusing just on a golden triangle. Cambridge isn't really there. Westminster and London aren't really there either. So this spot of Oxford, we can think of other locations. The significance of a intellectual tradition in the city of Canterbury, for example. From at least the 1450s and through into the early 16th century, and reflected also in the inscription on here, which is written in Roman capital. It's a Gothic building, but with humanist influence. Wells. So we can go to the Somerset. We can, the near southwest, we actually could go further, and we can go to Exeter as well to find humanist activity. What I'm doing is building on an argument made by Daniel Wakeland, which describes humanism being diffuse. It is not in a particular location, it is in a series of locations. And we can go further, because we have manuscripts which are produced by scribes who are in this case, Lincolnshire or Yorkshire, or by the person who becomes from the northeast, John Sherwood, becomes the Bishop of Durham and keeps his books at Bishop Auckland. But where's the northwest? We have the northeast, we have the southeast, we have the very southeast, we have the south central. Where's the northwest? That's the question. We also have Scotland. The reason why Britain was in the title of the book is that we have two examples of Scottish scribes working in Italy. So it isn't just, and this is George Kinnaman, graduate of the University of St Andrews, goes to Italy in 1451 probably, goes into the house of a cardinal who happens to be a cousin of the Pope, and has a really successful career as a scribe into the early 1460s, at which point he really makes it because he becomes a secretary to the Pope to pass and within probably about 30 years. An amazingly successful career, integral to the development of humanist activities, both in this and other elements. I can talk about that for ages, but we've only got another 25 minutes. Scotland as well, still no northwest. Where? I'll come back to that in a second. At this point, I have to make an admission. What I discussed in my 2019 book included some new research, which I hope was worthy of publication, but also sat in a forgotten tradition, a tradition which goes back to the 16th century. Or rather, a tradition which can seek its origins in the 16th century. Because what I've been describing in this plethora of actors in humanist interactions and development of an English humanist identity was known before, was known in the 1530s and early 1540s. Arguably, is then forgotten in the Elizabethan vernacular moment, but is there in the work of John Leland. England's proto-antiquary, the person who collects together information about the libraries and scholars of England at the point when this is being blown apart by the dissolution of monasteries and after the closure of the chantries. And he, and this is on the handout at the bottom of the first page and the top of the second page, produces, among his Latin poems, a poem, printed here in 1589, but he writes it in the 1530s, on the revival of learning, or of good letters. And I put sections of it onto the handout, because what he does in this is describe the ways in which England has a tradition of scholars who are integrated into humanist activity. in a way that actually most of his readers will probably not get all these names. But he is in some ways creating this sense of a genealogy or a dynasty of scholarship, going from John Free through John Tiptoft, Robert Fleming, William Grocyn, Thomas Linacre, William Selling, and John Colet, through into those of the 1520s, moving from the 1440s to 1460s through to the 1520s. So let's for a moment look at these people. John Free, we can exemplify in this manuscript sent to Thomas Beckington, the Bishop of Bath and Wells, so it lived in the cathedral at Wells. John Free himself is from Bristol. John Tiptoft, for whom he worked, had lands in East Anglia. Robert Fleming is he is the nephew of the Bishop of Lincoln, but it is from a Yorkshire family. Likewise, well, John Colet is London. Peter Megan, we'll come back to him. Low Countries. Cuthbert Tunstall is from near Ripon. And I could go on to the list of people. Thomas Linacre, probably from Canterbury. It's the same pattern. Southeast, South Central, Southwest. There's not much there. Northeast, definitely there. Scotland, for Lincoln, is definitely there. This is very much a Londoner's view of it. And again, where is the Northwest? I spent about half the time saying it's not there. So I better do something before you start throwing the handout or other things at me. And so, it's here. It's staring us in the face. John Leland didn't publish hardly anything of his works in his lifetime. Some poems in praise of Thomas Wyatt, some praise of Henry VIII, but the vast majority of his works weren't published, and some of them weren't published until the 18th century. His poems were published. His poems were printed in London in 1589 edited by Thomas Newton. Kestrelicistius. Yes, that doesn't really work, that's a term. He's from Cheshire. He's not just from Cheshire, he's from Macclesfield. That's where I grew up. And he was teacher at what by then was the King's School in Macclesfield. Had been established as a grammar school by Sir John Percival in 1502, but because of the Chantries Act, all those schools had to close because they had a chantry aspect to them and were then refounded as foundations of King Edward VI. Thomas Newton also edits the works of John Brownsword, who was his teacher at the King's School. John Brownsword was also a Cheshire person who was taught by John Bracegirdle in Northwich. What we can see here is a dynasty of school teachers in the Northwest, with Newton central to the saving of that memory of Leland's work, which in itself is a memory of the previous generations. You don't have to wait until the 19th century to have the Renaissance born on the banks of the Mersey. The memory of this Renaissance is being saved by Cheshiremen in response to the work of a London. Interesting question of how on earth did Thomas Newton, who is mainly a teacher in Macclesfield, get to know John Leland's manuscript? Did that come to Cheshire? It's now in Oxford. So again, an example of the eccentric argument, but I'm not, or process. We just don't know. But what's very striking is that process of talking about Bracegirdle to Brownsword to Newton, school teacher, we can't do it before the 16th century. The increasing availability of schools in the 16th century changes the intellectual structure and the avenues of the social mobility which is created by educational opportunity. So, let me take you back into the previous century. And what I want to concentrate on are two Northwesterners. The first of them is called Andrew Hollis, and I've given brief details of these on the second side of the handout. Andrew Hollis was from a family based on a Wirral, just south of Birkenhead. But Andrew Hollis, to have an education, couldn't go to a school in Manchester, or Macclesfield, Stockport, because he was born circa 1400. So he's going to school. He goes to school in 1407. He goes to school in Winchester. He goes to the establishment of, by the woman William Wickham, Bishop of Winchester from the 1370s, 30 years into his life. You need to think about the repeatedly changing educational possibilities that are happening in these years. He not only goes to Winchester, but then he goes on to the sister foundation of New College in Oxford. And after that, he has his career as an ecclesiastic, which starts off in the northwest, in Cheshire, but then he's exiled to Anglesey, and then he gets to travel abroad and is the royal proctor, the position pre that being an ambassador, at the papal curia from the late 1420s until the mid-1440s, until he settles in England, not in the northwest, but in the south, moving between Salisbury and Wells. So one example of how a Northwesterner had to move away to be able to achieve their success. Second example, generation or so later, born 1448, is Christopher Erswick, who was a partisan of Henry VII, before he dropped his surname, and lived with him on the continent and was part of the invasion in 1485 and becomes almoner to Henry VII and through that an ambassador going to Italy, France and to the Holy Roman Empire and also Dean of Windsor, who is involved in a notable collecting and commissioning of books, including many by the Dutch or Low Country scribe Peter Magan. Peter Magan, Erasmus's sort of favourite scribe. He only had one eye, and so Erasmus nicknamed him Cyclops. But also explains that he can't find Peter Magan because he's gone on a bender again, and it's probably taking a month to get so. But yeah, very steady hand. Erswick comes from near Furness. Erswick is, any Lancastrians here will know, is 9 miles north of Barrow. Well, he may have been to the school which we think existed in the Abbey, Furness. An important element in the history of education before the Reformation is not to think of the establishment of the grammar school, but to think of other structures where teaching could take place. He must have been at school somewhere, because he ends up in Cambridge, curiously late in his life, early 20s. Most people go to university in the 15th century when they're about 12. They were very clever then. But he also then becomes a warden of King's Hall before his successful career. But the point of focusing on these two individuals, separated though they are by a couple of generations, is They are produced. They are from the earth of the Northwest, and then both make their careers elsewhere. And in making their careers, they also make their book collections. They make their identity as humanist book commissioners, book owners, and readers. Andrew Hollis, during his time in Italy, was famous for having scribes in his household and for having them produce books, so many that when it came for him to finally return home, he had to commission a ship to carry the books back. This sort of excess luggage issue got wild. I just give you one example here. A copy of Lactantius, a church father who was celebrated by the Florentine humanists, partly because we have examples of Andrew Hollis adding marginalia himself, so we can see him engaging with the text, but also because the Greek's being added in. We have no sign. I mean, so in the 15th century, knowledge of Latin was among the literate, who of course are a small minority, particularly in England, in Florence, higher levels of vernacular literacy, but still minority in terms of Latin. It's not knowing Latin, it's knowing the style of Latin. It's knowing a Latin which would not say magnissimum opus, but would say maximum opus because you want to get the classical purity. The knowledge of Greek is much more limited and becomes a litmus test of not being just part of the avant-garde, but being of the avant-garde. And the fact that he asks for the Greek to be added in is a sign of this desire to be associated with a particular subsector of that humanist community, even though we have no sign that Hollis himself learnt Greek, in contrast, say, to the Scottish scribe George of Kinnaman, who I mentioned earlier, who certainly did learn Greek. This collection of books, notice Oxford, comes back to England, is probably with him in Salisbury. That's the most likely location during his lifetime, but after his death, his books partly get dispersed, but mainly get sent to Oxford colleges. And so notice this oxcentric process. By the 1490s, a significant proportion of humanist books in England are centred in that city. Take it back 20 years, it's not there. They're elsewhere. It's much more widely spread. And so there is, in some ways, is a funneling of the knowledge. Alongside him, I wanted to put before you a Cheshireman and a Lancastrian. And the Lancastrian, we come back to Christopher Erswick, who clearly has the money to have a scribe in his household, that scribe being most of the time Peter Megan. His manuscripts are also signs of his interaction with other scholars or with potential patrons. So a manuscript in Princeton is a manuscript copy of a printed book which had been given to him by John Colet, with a letter from John Colet to him, which Erswick gets written out by his scholar, Peter Megan. There's a really interesting issue, and again we might want to talk about it, about in the earliest decades of print, the desire to make books more permanent by turning them into real books, in other words, manuscripts. There's a sense in which the impermanence of the printed book could be dealt with by continuing the manuscript tradition. And that doesn't die for, Peter Megan can make his career into the 1530s, although, as I argue in my book, he's doing it by being very high-end niche. In this case, what we can also see is that Christopher Erswick is not just an owner of books, but he's an annotator. this manicular and line here, I hope, can you just about make that out? I don't think I can zoom in. There is one here, and then later you might want to go up and see that. And there are also notes that he's making in an even hand, but one which uses things like the ampersand as a sign of engagement with humanist style. I emphasize these because I want to go back to this book. You remember this? In this collection, produced for William Gray in Italy by the Low Country scribe Theodoric Werkin. Most of William Gray's books are also evidence of the eccentric process, because on his death in 1478, they were bequeathed to his old Oxford College of Baden. This one seems not to have gone there. This book was travelling. No, it was not in the northwest early on. The earliest we know it was in the northwest is in the late 19th century. But what has not been noticed before is that it has a piece of marginalia and a manicular, a pointing hand, and a line by Christopher Erswick. And so this is a reminder that we shouldn't just think of books at the moment of their production. When I'm working with my students around the cathedral on the area, the first time I hold a manuscript, don't worry about it. It's been alive much longer than you have been, and it's going to be alive much longer after you're dead. I don't worry about it, I worry about you. These are durable things, and we need to think through that full life. In this case, I think this is a really interesting moment of sensing a tradition in the creation. That is not just something which is produced and cast off, but is then seen by the next generation. And it is a history which cannot be confined to a single place or position. Let me add to that Christopher Erswick collects his books, and unlike Hollis, does not bequeath to a single institution. They disperse. This one actually probably goes out of his hand. No, it must go out of his hand during his lifetime. During his lifetime, but as another collector. So think of the horizontal links as well, vertical in terms of the chronology, but also this is a contemporaneous network of scholars. But not all of them stay in the south of England. There is one book which we know for certain was donated to the Liber Praedicatorum Lancastri, the book of the preachers of Lancaster, in other words, Dominicans. Printed a book of a humanist text, A History of Venice by Marcantonio Sabellico, which is donated by Christopher Erswick, who clearly had it when he was Dean of Windsor, which is it's on the handout 1496 and 1505. So, we've got it! A book in the Northwest. Well, except not now, it's in Aberdeen, but that's not really a Northwest. A book which came to the Northwest. Hooray! We have one book in the Northwest. Is that it? On what level? Yes. It is it. It isn't the case that there are significant collections of books in the Northwest in the 15th and 16th century. There isn't actually the structure that would usually support those in terms of educational foundations or cathedral foundations, despite Chester's role for the refoundation as the second seat of the See of Lichfield. And despite Chester's tradition of learning, including Hickman. But on the other hand, person like Christopher Erswick doesn't forget they're a Northwesterner. A person like Andrew Hollis doesn't send him his books to the north when he dies, but does bequeath to the Palaeography his relatives in Cheshire. In that case, clothes. And there's an interesting story to be told about those, which is a second. This, I suggest to you, is a story not about the Northwest, but about Northwesterners. And those Northwesterners stop being from the Northwest when, necessarily early in their life, they leave, may return at times, but do not at any point settle back. To gain identities is not to lose identity. And what these characters do is gain identities as they also gain ecclesiastical preferments, benefices, and books, and the accoutrements of a successful career. Notice that both Hollis and Erswick epitomise a hyper-mobile group of intellectuals, usually related to the church. Not all in Rylands' list are ecclesiastics. This hypermobility, I suggest, is what is integral to that Renaissance humanist identity. They are not of one place, but of many places. And what I suggest to you is that the centre-periphery dichotomy is problematic because it makes us think of geography as fixed points rather than moving parts. These individuals are the centre. The centre is that network of individuals who are moving, who are in circulation, some process of Brownian motion which allows for the continual creation of new identities, new collections, and indeed allows those no centre can exist without those peripheries. They're independent. Notice the way in which London is used by Thomas Newton to celebrate Hounsfield. And so, what I'm suggesting to you is that with these individuals, what we need to do is to focus our attention on where they go, how they move around. Think about the routes they travelled, but like them, never forgetting the routes from which they came. Thank you.
Thank you, David. That was absolutely wonderful. And a real panorama way of thinking about the period, as well as a wonderful intellectual tour through the 15th century. May I invite questions?
Hello. Yes, certainly. Thank you for picking up on that. I planted the question. I'll give you a copy, but not an idea here. There's an interesting issue that we can see owners of printed books employing scribes to transcribe them into manuscripts. I think that it works on two levels. One of them goes back to what Humanism says in his book on Praise of Scribes. Printing is a paper thing, and like paper, it will die. But the point there is print likes paper. Paper, well, Henrietta de Rolde would argue differently, and there are differences between different types of paper. You might want to read a great book on paper in medieval England, but it isn't seen as lasting. And so the manuscripts we made are manuscripts on parchment. And so that is going to assist it. However, I think there's another level on it, which is mechanical reproduction means that you own, on several levels, simulacrum. Remember that all printed books are actually trying to be manuscripts. Any typeface is wanting to be a script. It is an attempt to get out of it. And so when an early collector is looking at this, they are seeing something which is thinking about the manuscript because it can't think of anything else. Not quite true, that didn't mean to be completely fair. The different traditions of lettering. But also, is a sense in which this is not unique. And I want my copy. Now, of course, you can illuminate and make personal printed books, but it's making it after the fact rather than making it, doing it good. And so I think there are two drivers, a very practical one and a much more emotional response to the book. Thank you. Great question.
Yeah.
Thank you. I wondered, because it's still on the screen as well, if you had any thoughts on where those Dominicans might have been. The presentation, where those Dominicans might have been, the Lancastrian. The presentation description of it.
So this was in the Dominican house of
Lancaster.
So it says a Lancastrian it is of the town, the city of Lancaster. Yes, what?
Sorry, David, would you mind using the microphone actually so it gets picked up?
Okay, yeah, I'll speak quietly.
While gesturing.
I have to gesture as well. I can't do both things at the same. I'm just looking at the illumination and thinking about the processes of the arrival of this book. It's unlikely that Urswick, it wasn't in Italy long enough to be able to buy up many books. 1487. This is after he was there, so it must have been an imported book, which he then owns as dean and gives away quondam. Likely, it is a bequest, and so it would have gone to the Dominicans, but presumably only be there for under 20 years because of the dissolution of the house at the end of the 1530s. I don't know the actual year of it. Does that answer your question? Yeah.
Whilst you're thinking, I want to ask a question. I'd like to ask a question, which is really whether you could tell us a little more about the role of the Low Countries and the Rhenish scribes. That's my stock question. But you've mentioned them a number of times. Are these coincidentally Rylanders, or is there a particular tradition of Rhenish scribes who are sought out and have the requisite training to take on these sorts of roles?
Interesting where you took. Interesting where you took that, Stephen. Not sought out. In neither case of which I've just shown, Verkin or Megan, are they being called on and then become used. They make their careers outside of the Low Countries. the Bois-de-Duc is where the origin of Megan. Abenbroek is the origin of Werken. Werken goes to the University of Cologne, meets William Gray at the University of Cologne, and then goes into his household and goes with him to Italy. He's already learning to write humanist script in Cologne before he goes to Italy, but then perfects it there, comes back to England in about 1450. Megan might have been a student at the New University of Louvain, but then comes to England about 1500, quite early in his life, and gains commissioners early on. And from that, being supported by Urswick, John Colet, later Thomas Wolsey, later Henry VIII, he can make his career. What's really interesting is these examples are only two of a much wider phenomenon and not just with English patrons. I haven't put it on the handout, but there's an article I wrote about humanist scribes in Italy. If you go beyond Florence to Rome, for example, of the humanist scribes, under 50% are Italian. The majority are non-Italians, and of those, the majority are not those who identify themselves as wider German, but are from the Low Countries. Very interesting subset Megan talks himself as Teutonicus. He does self-identify as German, but there's also a sense of their Low Countries identities. What causes this? In the 15th century, and despite Werken going to Cologne, I think there may be an educational pull to the English universities. There's a significant number of students at Oxford from the Low Countries. But also potentially political dislocation, partly through the history of Burgundy, may affect this. So there may be push and pull factors. What's interesting is it's a diaspora in not all directions, because I don't think you could say the same thing about it happening in France, but it's certainly not a single direction. It's not unilinear. The really important in activity in Italy, but also in England. Okay?
Right. I really liked what you were saying about the text as like body language. I was just curious as to what extent other forms of body language could be present in the manuscripts as like created things, and if that could tie a regional. Like I was just thinking about the craftspeople responsible for making the manuscript and the body of the animal in that as a literal body language, sort of a bit meta, right? But if there's scope for that, I don't know.
I like where you're going with that. In terms of craft production, thank you. That's really interesting. You teach me. I can't think of significant regional differences in the British Isles in the style of production of parchment. It is often, maybe there's a different balance. And of course, we don't use invasive techniques, so this is usually done by the eye or by the feel of it. But sheep, of course, is the main animal which is being used, although, thinking about these manuscripts, calf is probably more often being used. In Italy, of course, goat is used rather than sheep. So there will be a difference between those produced in Italy and imported and those in England. So, or the British Isles. But I don't think we could say this is, and I don't think we're ever going to be able to find out what herd of cows this comes from. Yes. Is this a Jersey manuscript? The Channel Islands, there's a really interesting story there, but I'll tell you another time. Binding then, and illumination. Illumination to some extent does have regional variation, but illumination in the northwest, there aren't any significant centres. Again, it comes back to the point I was making, because you don't have the significant locations. I'm waiting for somebody to shout out, "Oh, you fool, how wrong you are." Go on, do it, please. Just for the fun. Binding. That manuscript, which we'll see, is in a blind stamp binding, which becomes the trendy style from the last quarter of the 15th century, and that does help with localizing and dating. But Salisbury, Canterbury, Oxford, Cambridge, those are the places where we can identify bindings at that point. Whittle bindings, which were probably being used in most places, are much less easy to identify. And so there are a whole range of ways in which I use body language because if we think of text as disembodied, we fail to realize that it cannot be that. Obviously, accepting Socrates' point about the primacy of the oral. I mean, so that we'd be moving into a different area of thinking there. But you're also right that the body language is not just about presentation on the page, but is about the substratum and the added elements to it. I can think of no elements, and this is an interesting issue. In Italy, you could subdivide. Regional is much more important. France, you can do that. German-speaking lands, you certainly can do that. Spain, Iberia, yeah, probably. Yes, you can. But England, actually, though there are differences, particularly in history of illumination, the regional is much less strong as an identity, despite the language of my country for a county. But thank you. There's more to think about that, but it's really useful.
Further questions?
I don't feel like St. Lawrence yet.
I realised that one of the manuscripts you presented was on the Vera Sapienta from Nicolas of Cousin, and I just wondered, with the influx of scribes from the Low Countries or from the Rhenish areas, to kind of a bit on par with Stephen's question, would there be any philosophical reasons or grounds or why one might want to establish himself being from that region in different areas, so rather than to contribute to a sort of a revival of learning, also a renewed attitude towards learning, perhaps?
In what way could you explain about renewed attitude?
A sort of, well, I view of, and when I think of Nicolas of Cousin, I think of his attitude against sort of the more central medieval scholastic methods of learning. So whether there might be any philosophical reasons for people moving from the Low Countries or from the Rhenish areas to help establish, alongside sort of the newer sort of forms of learning and the sort of renaissance that we see sort of in the text, in the body language, etc. Also sort of to help establish that renewed attitude towards learning. Sort of alongside.
Okay, I understand where you're going, and it's a really useful point, and I should have acknowledged the set-piece battles which do take place between scholastics and humanists, and of course in the German educational tradition are seen as a litmus test of the, have at times been seen as a litmus test of the development of engagement with humanist texts. There's a caveat to this. Nicolas Cusa actually not much read in England, and in this case it's not attributed to him, it's attributed to Petrarch. And so that misattribution is probably significant. Having said that, this person also owns works by Savonarola, which doesn't quite fit with a sense of a particular single program. And I don't think that people would be thinking of trying to escape scholastic strongholds, and if they did, it would have been a bit odd to try and come to, well, actually, any university. Because so how I see the universities is that, you might not have noticed this, but universities tend to be cumbersome beasts which change very slowly because of the dead weight of bureaucratic hands. I'm sure it's changed nowadays. But they give opportunities. It's not what happens in the lecture hall, it's what happens around it. And so the development of humanist interest in Padua, I'd argue, but certainly elsewhere, is what happens with communities who are meeting in the taverns or in people's houses, or in relation to the Chancellor of the city, rather than in the first case in the lecture halls. The lecture halls catch up much later on. One exception to that would be Palaeography. But that means that places like Oxford, Paris, Louvain, of course, that's a bit different, but that's we're taking a generation after Peter Megan was there. Cologne, less so. But in those cases, what's happening is that non-scholastic isn't what they're being taught, but is what they have as an add-on through their extra activities. In this case, interesting whether it would be seen as novel, or by this point, this is being produced 1502, whether actually it's already having a sense of being fairly established. In a way that the fact that he gets Savonarola transcribed very soon after publication. Luther, before he never becomes a Lutheran, Christopher Urswick, but before 1517, he has some of Luther's works copied with Savonarola's works. And so religious reform before intellectual reform between the scholastic and the humanist, but the humanist is part of that theological religious. I hope that goes towards answering your question. Thank you.
Have a final question? Don't. Then I think we are perfectly in time. So, before I give some organisational instruction, I'd like to take this opportunity to thank David once again for a wonderful paper.